Hello and welcome to the channel. Today we're going to be looking at a very famous graphics card from 3DFX. And no, it's not this. This is a 4MB Righteous 3D Voodoo 1 from Orchid. And we are going to be looking at this card, but it is not the star of the show. So this was released by 3DFX in 1996, October I believe. But what we're actually going to be looking at and comparing it today is the much maligned Voodoo Rush. Released about 7 months later. This one was from April 1997. And yeah, I've always wanted one of these. Now I've got one. And it seemed to me a good comparison, since theoretically this is the same chipset, would be to compare the two. So these would have been your two options in the shop, in the shops sort of early 1997. Which one should you choose? That is the question. The Rush has a kind of spotty reputation. Why was it called the Rush? Perhaps it was the rush to get it to market. Perhaps they should have waited and paid a bit more attention. Anyway, we'll find out in just a minute if that reputation is deserved or not. You can see that this particular one has a mounting bracket that didn't originally come with. I'll have to dig around some of my less desirable graphics cards and see if I can find a better fit. Apart from that, the main differences on this thing is memory. It has 6 megs as opposed to the 4 megs on the Voodoo 1. That is to do with the architecture, which we'll go into in just a moment. So I was lucky enough to find, on, of all things, a Russian retro computer enthusiast site, that this looks very much like my board might be an A-Corp board like this one, and the layout is pretty much identical. The BIOS chips in the same place and all of that. I had a look everywhere else, couldn't find another one with this layout, so pretty sure that's what it is, which is nice to know. Yeah, this site has some interesting information. So this thing retailed at $299, so its main competitors would be the Riva 128 from NVIDIA and the Rage Pro from ATI. That is, of course, if you accept the competition as being other people who had combined 3D and 2D cards, but to some extent it must have also competed against the Voodoo 1, which is a bit strange. I guess there's a reason why they did it, but it could have been serious competition to the Voodoo 1 had it been more successful. So I don't know whether that was the hope, that if this thing had taken off, it would have replaced the Voodoo 1. Maybe we would have never even got to the Voodoo 2, and what became the Banshee, which was essentially half a Voodoo 2 with 1 TMU missing, might have been a fully fledged 2 TMU combined card, but who knows. It's cool that the site also included the benchmark for their 3D Mark 99, where they ran it at 640 by 480. I suspect that's pretty much all this card is really going to be able to do. So that's cool, because we're going to be running the exact same benchmark shortly, so we'll see how it compares. The 3DFX originally went to Macronix, I think, for a 2D partner for the 2D side of the card, and they obviously had no intentions of developing it themselves at that point. And that deal fell through, so they ended up going to Alliance, who already created a card called the AT3D. So that's what this is here. This was a combined 2D, 3D card of their own, which has disappeared into the oblivion of forgotten history. There's probably a good reason for that, but basically they opted to use this chip. I think it was called the AT24, which is the 2D half of it, but I believe that 3DFX just used this chip and disabled the 3D section of it. When I was looking for drivers for my card, I kept on seeing these double versions. There was a version for what was called a dual planar board and a version for a single planar board. So as far as I can gather, what happened originally when it very first came out was you would buy your Alliance AT3D card, and then it had like a sort of socket on the top, and then you could get the 3DFX part of it, the Voodoo 1 chip set, and plug it into the top, just like that. So you'd end up with a 2 planar board, which I believe didn't work very well at all. So very quickly they were integrated onto a single planar board like the one that I have. The other thing that we were talking about before was the memory. So we've got 6 megs on here, and that's split differently. So on the Voodoo we have 4 megs, 2 megs of which is for the frame buffer and 2 megs for processing textures. On here, we still have the same 2 megs for processing textures, but the other 4 megs is shared between the 2D side of the card and the 3D side of the card. So that was one of the problems. I think the memory chips even shared pins, so I don't know, I'm guessing that potentially you might get a sort of race condition to get the information into memory potentially between the 2D and the 3D card, which may have hampered the performance. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see how it compares with the 4 megs on the Voodoo card. And the machine we're going to be using to test all this on is this rather handsome Quintec. It's an early socket 370 300 megahertz Pentium III, which is good because both of these cards are sensitive to memory, and once you get above 500 megs you start getting issues. So this should be well within the zone that they can both cope with. And yeah, let's get the rush in first and see how things go. We've taken the Rage 128 that came with this machine out and we've replaced it with the Rush, and it sits alongside a Sound Blaster 128, which we'll be using for sound, 512 megs of RAM and Windows 98. Let's see how it goes. Okay, I haven't actually tried this card, so fingers crossed that it works. Haven't had it very long. I couldn't find any way when I was looking for drivers of disabling VSync on this thing. I tried a few tools and things, but to no avail. So I'm hoping that it's all going to be well below the refresh rate of the monitor. I suspect it will be. So I found the drivers for this on the Falconfly website, that rather excellent, I think it's Falconfly, the German site that is dedicated. I think it's German as well. Hope I'm not offending anybody here. But yeah, there's an awesome site. I don't think it's actively maintained anymore, but it's archived and you can get all sorts of exciting 3DFX type stuff there. So I got the latest drivers I could find on there for the single planar board. And we can see here it's all emblazoned with the logo for both Alliance and 3DFX. There's a few settings in there that I don't think we need to worry about in particular, but it's all installed, it's all running, and yeah, cool. So at least it works. That's one thing. So we'll get some benchmarks done and see how it performs. So as well as benchmarking, this is going to be about compatibility as well. So we're going to start with Unreal, and yeah, the Voodoo Rush was not renowned for being terribly compatible with Glide games, which you think would be the primary reason for buying the card. So we're going to try it with Unreal first of all. I thought that would be a pretty good one to benchmark. So when we first go in and fire it up for the first time, the first thing it asks you is, do you have a 3DFX card? Yes, we do. Click yes. What the? If you just went out and bought Unreal thinking you had a 3DFX card, you would not be pleased to see this. So that's not great. It doesn't really make it clear on the outside of the box either. I would have been damn pissed off if I bought a Voodoo Rush and got out and bought this game. And letting it roll on in Direct 3D in Unreal, well, well, what can you say? Not a very successful first game, so it doesn't bode well for the Rush at this point. Next up I tried Forsaken, nice glide game with a built-in benchmark, so I thought this would be a good one to do. So I fired up the kind of logo screens at the beginning and then bang, I wouldn't run that one either, off to a bad start. At least 3D Mark 99 installed and ran okay, so that was the first. At least we'll get a benchmark to compare with that one that we got off the other website, so that'll be interesting. At least 3D Mark lets you know up front that you're not going to get anything more than 640 by 480 out of this thing, which kind of didn't really expect anyway. But we'll get the benches done and we'll go over the results after we've run the same things with the Voodoo. So for synthetic benches, as well as 3D Mark 99, we're going to be using Final Reality, which is quite a nice one, and seems to install and run okay with that as well. So for the synthetic benches, albeit they're both running in Direct 3D, no problems at all. One thing that I have done with the Voodoo Rush is pay attention to the notes and the readmes that come with the various benchmarks and games. because they quite often have something written in them about the Voodoo Rush. Here, there was clearly a problem with Final Reality at one point, but they fixed it in a patch, so that explains why it's working properly, I guess. Expendable was another one that I thought would be good for this. We'll be able to do a glide benchmark in here because they're in short supply because I haven't had much luck with the glide games with benchmarks so far. So Expendable did install and did run, so that was a good thing, and we can use that as a benchmark for the glide stuff. I installed Incoming and that seemed to be fine. I think it's DirectX, so I think it's only really glide that you have a problem with. Battlezone was another game. I was going to try and run this with Fraps. This is a glide game, and it did install, but I couldn't get Fraps running with it, so that was a bit of a no-go. I was hoping to get it running over the intro sequence. Quake 2 I thought would be a good one for some OpenGL stuff. I read many places people running Quake 2 successfully on the Rush, but this was the best I could get out of it. This was despite trying a multitude of different card drivers and a multitude of different mini GL drivers. It just couldn't get it to work. It would run in software, would not run in OpenGL. So that was a bit of a bummer. And again, with Quake 2, scrolling through the README, it clearly states, if you scroll down, that both the Voodoo and the Voodoo Rush should work with the included OpenGL driver. So that was a real shame. I tried running Flying Core Gold, which I thought would be a nice early glide game just to see if it worked. Basically, by this point, I was just randomly grabbing games off my shelf. I was trying to stick for games between 1996 and 1998, but this thing, it would just installed, fired up, minimized. When you open the minimized screen, this is what you got. That was as far as I got. No Flying Core Gold for the Voodoo Rush. So there it is. It's out of the machine now. It's a sexy looking card, I have to say. I like the look of it. And yeah, so will it fare well in the benchmarks we've managed to do against the original Voodoo? Taylor Swift thinks so. Everybody's hopeful, but we'll find out in just a second, because now that this card is out, it's time to switch over and put the Voodoo in. Initially, I was trying to pair it with a PCI 2D card, but this machine was having none of it, so I had to go back to the AGP Rage 128 that was in the machine originally, and it seemed to work okay with that. So let the benchmarking begin, and I'm rooting for the Voodoo Rush.
May the odds be ever in your favor.
We begin with 3D Mark 99, and as previously seen, it will only do 640 by 480. I don't think I'm even going to bother trying 800 by 600 on any of these benchmarks. And when the results came in, kind of what you'd expect. So, my Voodoo Rush 3D Mark 99 was a little bit slower than the one that we saw on that website, but in the same ballpark. The Voodoo's a bit faster, so 1059 versus 1523. And the frame rates for the two games, the two demo games, the race game and the first person shooter, are a little bit faster for the Voodoo, about 30% faster, and the texture fill rate was slightly faster. That's the 2 megs. I'm not quite sure how much of the 4 megs on the Rush was getting used for that. But yeah, the Voodoo is ahead for sure in 3D Mark 99. On to Final Reality. I couldn't see any way to change the resolution on this, so I'm guessing it's running at 640 by 480. And yeah, the scores were much closer on this. I was quite surprised. I'm not exactly sure how it tests the system in Final Reality, but reasonably close scores, 3.56 versus 3.68. But again, we've got a slight edge with the Voodoo card, so yeah, tough. Rush comes second again. On to the first proper game, so Incoming, where we can just set the frame counter going with a few little hacky entries over the menu, and this was pretty close as well. So I guess you're both the cards are kind of in reasonably playable frame rates here for the time. Again, the Voodoo has maybe got 4 frames a second over the Rush, but yeah, they look like they could both potentially handle this game. Sounds terrible now, but back in those days, 30 frames a second wasn't too bad. And finally onto the glide bench for expendable. And yeah, clear lead for the Voodoo in this one, sort of 20 frames a second versus 30 frames a second. So you're going to get a much nicer experience using the Voodoo. And this game I did actually manage to get running at 800 by 600, but it was painful in both cases, so I didn't think it was worth really including here. So there we have it, benchmark complete. I know it was a bit basic given the fact that I couldn't get half of the things that I wanted to running on the Rush. And yeah, I do get the impression that the Rush's reputation was fairly well earned. I did speak to quite a few people on X when I showed a picture of my card who had one and for real as their main gaming card. And by and large, most of them seemed quite happy with it. But I do think you have a tendency to be happy with what you've got. Like I loved my Banshee when I had it back in the day. A lot of people don't have many kind words for the Banshee these days in hindsight, but I loved it then. And I'm sure the people who had the Rush loved their Rushes. And depending on what kind of games you played, you might have had a fairly easy experience. From what somebody was saying, there was quite a lot of patching going on with the Rush, like game patches and things like that. So I guess once you knew what you had and you checked for patches first, maybe it wasn't such a bad experience. Quality-wise, the 2D looked absolutely fine to me, I have to say, despite some negative things that I've read. And when it did run, it looked fine in 3D as well. So yeah, 3DFX had a good thing on their hands in early 1997. You've got to wonder what exactly, I guess it was the competition, fear of the competition. Well, they didn't realise that everybody was buying their cards, albeit add-on cards, over the competition. So, and that continued for a while with the Voodoo 2. Why they had this kind of weird urge to make this, who knows? I guess it was just they felt like they needed to be on the same playing field as the other people instead of doing their own thing. But yeah, there we go. The Voodoo Rush. It's been fun. I'm glad I didn't have to go through all of that shenanigans, checking things work. I don't know, whether the kind of games I played back then, whether I would run into much of this stuff. But it does sound like there was potential pain to be had with the Voodoo Rush. And yeah, it was quite a crazy idea the way they put it together by sort of basically melding two cards together, like a mild mind meld in Star Trek, and ending up with this crazy, funny card. But that's it. I hope you enjoyed watching it, this little trip through experiencing the Voodoo Rush for the first time. If you did, it'd be great if you consider subscribing and thumbing up and all the rest of it. And I hope to see you on the next video. Thanks for watching. Bye.